Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to be doing a deep dive into Kate Mann's Unshrinking, How to Face Fatphobia.
Oh, this is a good one.
Yeah, we have some excerpts from the book to work with.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at her main arguments and some of the personal stories she shares. It's going to be really interesting. We're going to be exploring how fatphobia operates not just as a dislike of fat people, but as a full-blown system of oppression that's ingrained in our culture.
Yeah, one thing I noticed right away was how she uses the word fat as just a neutral descriptor.
Yeah.
It's not like an insult or anything. It's just a word, like tall or short.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important because it kind of sets the stage for the whole book. It's like she's reclaiming the word and taking away its power to be used as a weapon.
And it makes you realize how loaded the word really is, like how much baggage it carries, you know?
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that makes Mann's work so important. She's not afraid to tackle these really difficult and uncomfortable topics head on, and she does it in a way that's both insightful and accessible.
So before we get into the specifics, what's Mann's actual definition of fatphobia? What does she mean by that?
Well, she makes it very clear that fatphobia is not just about disliking fat people.
Oh?
It's much deeper than that. It's about a whole hierarchy of value based on weight, where thinner bodies are seen as better than fatter bodies.
So it's like a ranking system.
Exactly. And that ranking system has real consequences. It affects how people are treated, how they're seen, how they see themselves.
And it's so pervasive. It's everywhere you look, you know?
Yeah. In the media, in advertising, in our healthcare system, in our personal relationships, it's really insidious.
And one of those disturbing things that Mann talks about is the idea that fatness is seen as a moral failing.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Like there's this pervasive belief that fat people are lazy or greedy or lacking self-control. That's almost like being fat is a character flaw.
Right. And she really dismantles that notion in chapter 4, demoralizing fatness.
I haven't gotten to that chapter yet.
It's really good.
Yeah.
She introduces this concept called the ought implies can fallacy. The ought implies can fallacy. It basically means that it's morally wrong to hold someone responsible for something that they can't control.
Okay, that makes sense.
So you can't blame someone for being fat if they can't actually control their weight.
Right, but how does that relate to fat phobia?
Well, think about all the pressure that fat people face to lose weight.
Oh, yeah.
It's everywhere. And the underlying message is that if you're fat, it's because you're not trying hard enough. You lack willpower. You're just not good enough.
So it's not just about aesthetics, it's about morality.
Right. And that's really damaging because it creates this system of blame where fat people are constantly being judged and shamed for something that they may not be able to control.
And Manne even talks about her own struggles with this, right?
Yes. She opens chapter 4 with this really honest and vulnerable anecdote about her own dieting attempts, how she was trying to achieve moral goodness through hunger and food restriction.
It's like punishing yourself for existing in a body that doesn't fit the mold.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point that Manne makes, how health is often used as a weapon to justify fatphobia.
Oh, yeah, I was just thinking about that. It's like the go-to argument whenever someone tries to challenge weight stigma. It's always, but what about their health?
Right. And Manne really dissects this in chapter 3, Venus in retrograde.
What does she say?
She argues that while health is important, this concern often masks deeper prejudices.
So it's like a shield.
Exactly. It's a way to justify discrimination without having to admit to it. And she digs into the history of fatphobia, showing how negative attitudes towards fat bodies actually predate modern medical concerns about obesity.
So it's not really about health then. It's about something else.
Right. It's about these deeper social anxieties about control and moral judgment.
Which is crazy because we know that health is so much more than just weight. There are so many other factors that play a role.
Absolutely. And Manne brings up this fascinating example to illustrate how our perceptions of body size have changed over time. The Venus of Willendorf. The Venus of Willendorf. It's a Paleolithic figurine of a woman with a very full figure. And it suggests that at one point in time, fatness wasn't automatically seen as negative or unhealthy.
That's interesting. So if these negative attitudes predate modern medicine, then what shifted? Why are we so obsessed with weight now?
That's a great question. And it's something that Manne explores in depth throughout the book.
I'm starting to see how all of this connects. But what about the tools we use to measure health? Isn't the BMI a good indicator of someone's health?
Ah, the BMI. Well, that's where Manne really gets into the weeds. And she's not afraid to call out the BMI for what it is. A deeply flawed and culturally biased measure that's not designed to actually assess individual health.
I've always wondered about that. I mean, it doesn't take into account things like muscle mass or bone density, right?
Exactly.
But
And it wasn't even created to measure health in the first place. It was developed by a Belgian mathematician in the 1800s based on data from white European men. So it's not even representative of the diverse range of human bodies that exist.
so it's like we're using this one-size-fits-all tool that wasn't even designed for this purpose. And yet it's used to make all these judgments about people.
It's pretty ridiculous when you think about it. And the irony is that the stress and stigmatization that can result from a high BMI can actually negatively impact your health.
Wow. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're stressed about your weight because of the BMI, which then impacts your health, further reinforcing the idea that you need to lose weight.
Precisely. And this cycle becomes even more complex when we consider how fat phobia intersects with other forms of oppression.
Okay, I've heard that term intersectionality before, but can you remind me what it means in this context?
Sure. It basically means that people's identities are multifaceted and that different forms of oppression like racism, sexism, classism, ableism, transphobia, and in this case, fat phobia, can overlap and create unique challenges for individuals.
So it's not just about weight in isolation. It's about how those other aspects of your identity can make the experience of fat phobia even more intense.
Exactly. And Mann uses some really powerful examples to illustrate this point.
Like what?
Well, she talks about the case of Sarah Bartman, the Khoisan woman who was exploited in freak shows in the 19th century for her body shape.
Oh yeah, that's horrible.
It's a really tragic story. And it highlights the deeply racist and sexist dimensions of fat phobia, how her body was seen as this monstrous deviation from European beauty standards.
And she connects that to how black women are still facing disproportionate scrutiny of their bodies today.
Absolutely. They're often targeted by harmful stereotypes that link fatness to laziness, hypersexuality, and even savagery.
It's like these stereotypes have deep historical roots and they continue to play out in really harmful ways.
Yeah, and it underscores how dismantling fat phobia requires confronting not just individual bias, but systemic injustice as well.
So it's not just about changing individual attitudes, it's about changing the systems that perpetuate these biases.
Yeah.
But how do these systems actually manifest in everyday life? It's not like people are walking around openly saying, I'm fat phobic, right?
True, it's often much more subtle than that. Well, think about all the microaggressions and backhanded compliments that fat people constantly face. Like, you have such a pretty face, or you'd be so attractive if you just lost weight.
It's like this constant pressure to shrink, to apologize for taking up space.
Exactly. And those comments, even if they're disguised as compliments, can really chip away at your self-esteem.
And they can lead to internalized fat phobia, where people
Mhm.
start believing those negative messages about themselves.
Absolutely. And Mann shares a really powerful personal story in the book about how she used Adderall to suppress her appetite.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a really honest and vulnerable account of how desperate people can become to escape the stigma of fatness and how dangerous those attempts can be.
And she ended up with some pretty serious health consequences, right?
Yeah, both physical and mental. It's a stark reminder that the pursuit of thinness can come at a very steep price.
And, it's not just individuals who are perpetuating these messages.
Yeah.
There's a whole industry that profits from our insecurities.
You're talking about diet culture, right?
Yeah, that whole system that makes us doubt our own bodies and experiences.
Mann really digs into how diet culture functions as a form of gaslighting.
I think I've heard that term before, but
Yeah.
can you break it down for me? What exactly does gaslighting mean in this context?
Sure, it's basically a form of manipulation where someone makes you doubt your own perceptions and reality.
Okay.
So, in the context of diet culture, it's about being told that your hunger is wrong, that your body is wrong, and that you're the problem for not being able to control your weight, despite evidence to the contrary.
So you're being manipulated into believing that you need to change yourself even if there's nothing wrong with you in the first place.
Exactly. And Mann draws this really brilliant parallel between the manipulative tactics of an abuser in the play Gaslight and how diet culture operates.
Wow. That's a really disturbing comparison, but it makes so much sense.
Yeah, it's like they're both trying to make you question your own sanity, your own experiences, and ultimately your own worth.
So if we're constantly surrounded by these messages, how do we even begin to resist?
That's where Mann introduces the concept of body reflexivity.
And what is that?
It's about shifting the focus from external judgments to internal experiences.
So instead of trying to please others, it's about prioritizing your own needs and desires.
Exactly. It's about reclaiming your body as your own, not an object to be scrutinized and controlled by others. And that can be really powerful.
That sounds great in theory, but I imagine it's not easy to achieve in a culture that's so obsessed with telling us how we should look and feel.
You're right, it's not easy. But Manne argues that it's possible. And it starts with small steps, like paying attention to how your body feels when you eat certain foods or engage in certain activities. Notice what brings you pleasure, what nourishes you, what makes you feel strong and energized, and start making choices that align with those feelings rather than with external pressures.
So it's about learning to trust your body again.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about how fat phobia plays out in our thoughts and beliefs. But how does it actually manifest in our relationships with others? Does Manne delve into that at all?
Absolutely. She explores how fat phobia impacts our most intimate relationships, particularly through sexual fat phobia.
Sexual fat phobia. So
That's
that's the idea that fat bodies are seen as undesirable.
Exactly. And Manne doesn't shy away from sharing her own experiences with this. She talks about feeling rejected and fetishized.
Wow, that's really brave of her.
Yeah, it's a really personal and vulnerable account, and it highlights how deeply ingrained sexual fat phobia is in our culture. It's not just about individual preferences, it's about a whole system that prizes thinness and equates it with beauty and worthiness.
So fat people are basically denied the right to express their sexuality freely, to be seen as desirable and worthy of love and intimacy.
Right, and Manne doesn't shy away from exploring the darker side of sexual fat phobia as well.
Oh no, what do you mean?
She talks about the harassment, the shaming, even the violence that fat people, especially women, are subjected to because of their size.
That's awful. It really underscores how fat phobia isn't just about words or attitudes. It has real-world consequences.
Absolutely. And it can have a profound impact on mental health.
Yeah.
Manne discusses the shame, the anxiety, the self-doubt that many fat people experience as a result of this constant bombardment of negative messages.
That's carrying this heavy burden.
Yeah.
Always feeling like you're not good enough, not worthy enough.
Yeah.
And that can be really isolating.
It really can. And it highlights the need for support systems, for spaces where fat people can feel seen and heard and valued for who they are, regardless of their size.
And Manne doesn't just focus on the negative, though, right? Doesn't she also offer some ways to resist fat phobia?
She does. And we're going to dive deeper into that in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready for a little break, though. This is a lot to process.
I know, right? But it's important stuff. And we're just getting started. We'll be back in a flash to explore Manne's vision for a more just and equitable future.
Okay, so before the break, we were talking about how insidious fat phobia can be, like how it seeps into our relationships and even our own self-perception.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It is. But Manne doesn't just leave us hanging with a critique, right?
No, not at all. She offers a path forward, and that's what makes Unshrinking so compelling.
One thing that really stuck with me was her personal story about her fear of being diagnosed with diabetes. It wasn't even just about the health implications, but there was this deep-seated panic. Like the diagnosis itself would be a moral failing.
Yeah, it speaks to that shame. You hit the nail on the head. It's like fat people are to blame for their health conditions, even if those conditions are totally unrelated to weight.
And the irony is that stress, that constant feeling of shame, probably negatively impacts their health even more.
Exactly. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It really underscores the need to separate moral judgments from medical realities.
Okay, but what about the actual science? I know we talked about how the BMI is flawed, but doesn't weight directly impact health?
Well, that's where Manne really challenges the dominant narrative. She cites research showing that weight is far less controllable and far less of a death sentence than we've been led to believe. Like, remember that UCLA study she mentions? The one that analyzed 31 long-term diet studies? They found that most people regain the weight they lose, and sometimes even more within a few years.
You're saying diets don't really work long-term?
The research seems to suggest that. And even more recent research supports this. There was a 2020 meta-analysis that looked at over 120 diet trials. Guess what they found?
What?
After 12 months, most diets made no significant difference to cardiovascular health.
So despite all the emphasis on dieting and weight loss, the evidence just isn't there to support it as a sustainable solution. It makes you wonder why we're so obsessed with it.
Manne argues that it's not just about health, it's about deeper societal anxieties. It's about control, about morality, about fitting into a narrow mold of what's deemed acceptable. Remember how she calls health a smokescreen for other prejudices?
Right, it's like this fear of fatness is rooted in something deeper, something beyond just physical well-being.
Exactly. And we have to consider the costs of shrinking ourselves, both physically and mentally. Manne points out that the stress of dieting, the restriction, the constant focus on food, it can take a real toll on our mental and emotional health.
And that focus on food can be so all-consuming. It's like you're constantly thinking about what you can and can't eat, feeling guilty for enjoying certain foods. It takes away the pleasure of eating.
Absolutely. And what's often overlooked is that physical activity, regardless of weight, has a huge impact on health.
She mentions a study where overweight and obese participants who were physically active had no more cardiovascular risk than their normal weight counterparts who were also active. So it's not just about weight, it's about movement.
It's a powerful reminder that we need to shift our focus from shrinking our bodies to moving our bodies in ways that feel good and that looks different for everyone.
Okay, so if the science is so shaky and the costs of dieting are so high, why are we so fixated on this idea of an obesity epidemic?
Manne argues that it's not just about health, it's about moral panic, about societal anxieties that are projected onto bodies. Remember, she traces the history of fat phobia back centuries, showing how negative attitudes actually predate modern medicine.
So it's like fatness became this symbol of moral and social deviance long before we had the science to back it up. And those attitudes continue to influence how we see and treat fat people today.
Exactly. And that brings us back to a crucial point. Fat phobia doesn't exist in a vacuum. It intersects with other forms of oppression in really complex ways.
You mean how fat phobia is amplified when it overlaps with racism, sexism, classism, ableism, transphobia?
Exactly. It creates this layered experience of discrimination, making it even harder for people at those intersections to navigate the world. Think about how Black women are targeted by harmful stereotypes that link fatness to laziness, hypersexuality, and even savagery.
It's like these stereotypes have deep historical roots, going back to the exploitation of Black women's bodies during slavery and colonialism. And those racist tropes still persist today, influencing everything from media representation to healthcare disparities.
It's a sobering reminder that fat phobia isn't just about individual attitudes, it's woven into the very fabric of our society.
And those harmful stereotypes don't just impact Black women. Manne discusses how fat Black men and masculine bodies are also subject to this system of oppression.
Absolutely. She cites the tragic cases of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, both killed by police, who used their size to justify their actions.
It's heartbreaking. And it shows how fat phobia can be a matter of life and death, especially for those at the intersection of multiple marginalized identities.
These cases highlight how urgent it is to dismantle not just individual bias, but the systemic injustices that perpetuate fat phobia.
And it's not always overt discrimination. It's often these subtle, insidious messages that can be even harder to challenge.
Like those microaggressions and backhanded compliments we talked about. Like, you have such a pretty face, or you'd be so attractive if you just lost weight. It's like this constant pressure to shrink, to apologize for taking up space.
And those messages can really chip away at your self-esteem. They can lead to internalized fat phobia where you start believing those negative things about yourself.
Exactly. And Manne shares that really powerful story in the book about how she used Adderall to suppress her appetite.
Yeah.
It's a stark example of how desperate people can become to escape the stigma and how dangerous those attempts can be.
It's a reminder that the pursuit of thinness can come at a steep price, both physically and mentally. And, it's not just individuals who are perpetuating these messages. There's a whole industry that profits from our insecurities.
You're talking about diet culture, right?
Yeah. Manne really breaks down how this system works to make us doubt our own bodies and experiences. She calls it a form of gaslighting, where people are manipulated into believing they're the problem for not being able to control their weight. It's like this constant barrage of messages telling us that we're not good enough, not thin enough, not worthy enough, and it's reinforced by everything from advertising to social media to well-meaning family members.
It's everywhere.
It's insidious. And what's even more disturbing is that this gaslighting can show up in healthcare settings as well. Manne shares some really eye-opening experiences about how she was treated by doctors and nurses, where her weight was always the focus, regardless of the reason for her visit.
Yeah, like you walk into the doctor's office, and before they even ask you how you're feeling, they're already judging you based on your size.
Right, and that can make you feel really vulnerable and dismissed.
Exactly. And Manne points out how this can lead to misdiagnoses, inadequate treatment, and even medical fat shaming. Imagine going to the doctor for a sore throat and they tell you to lose weight.
It's like your concerns aren't being taken seriously and your health is being reduced to a number on the scale.
It's dehumanizing.
It is.
And Manne connects this back to the idea of himpathy, this tendency to sympathize more with men even when they're the perpetrators of harm. She argues that this plays a role in how we view fat people, especially women in healthcare settings.
So we're more likely to believe a thin doctor, even if they're being dismissive or judgmental. than a fat patient who's advocating for their own health.
Exactly. And Manne highlights how this bias can have a real impact on access to healthcare, particularly for fat women.
And it's not just about physical health. Manne also explores how fat phobia impacts our mental and emotional well-being, particularly in the realm of relationships and sexuality.
You're talking about sexual fat phobia, right? Where fat bodies are deemed undesirable.
Yes, Manne gets really personal in the book, sharing her own experiences with feeling rejected and fetishized.
It's incredibly brave of her to be so vulnerable. It's like she's giving voice to an experience that's often silenced and shamed.
And it's not just about individual preferences. Manne points out how sexual fat phobia is perpetuated by a culture that prizes thinness and equates it with beauty and worthiness.
Like, fat people are denied the right to express their sexuality freely, to be seen as desirable and worthy of love and intimacy.
It is dehumanizing.
It really is. And she doesn't shy away from exploring the darker side of sexual fat phobia either.
What do you mean?
You know, the harassment, the shaming, even the violence that fat people, especially women, are subjected to because of their size.
It's disturbing how often this happens. And it underscores how fat phobia isn't just about words or attitudes. It has real-world consequences.
It impacts your safety, your relationships, your sense of self-worth.
And all of this can have a profound impact on mental health.
Hmm.
Manne talks about the shame, the anxiety, the self-doubt that many fat people experience as a result of this constant bombardment of negative messages. It can be incredibly isolating.
It can. And it highlights the need for support systems, for spaces where fat people can feel seen and heard and valued for who they are, regardless of size.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think that's something we can all do. Create more inclusive and accepting spaces for all body types. We need to be more mindful of the language we use, the jokes we make, the assumptions we hold.
Be more mindful.
You're right. Challenging fat phobia starts with recognizing our own biases and being willing to unlearn them.
And being open to hearing from fat people about their lived experiences.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive. We've explored the science behind weight and health, the historical roots of fat phobia, the way it intersects with other forms of oppression, the damaging effects of diet culture and internalized fat phobia, the personal and intimate impact of sexual fat phobia, and the ways in which fat phobia manifests in healthcare settings. It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
But before we wrap things up, I'm curious to hear more about what Manne proposes as a path forward. Does she offer any concrete strategies for resisting fat phobia and creating a more just and equitable world?
She does, and that's what we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Kate Manne's Unshrinking. We've talked about how pervasive and harmful fat phobia is, but I'm really curious to hear more about Manne's vision for the future. Like, what can we actually do about this?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? How do we move forward?
Exactly. Does Manne offer any concrete strategies for resisting fat phobia and creating a world that's actually just and equitable for all bodies?
She does. One of the key things she talks about is cultivating body reflexivity, which we touched on earlier.
Right. Can you remind us what that means again and how we can actually put it into practice?
Sure. It's basically about shifting our focus from how our bodies are perceived by others to how we experience them ourselves.
Okay, so less about external validation, more about internal awareness.
Yeah, exactly. Instead of constantly trying to shrink ourselves to fit into these external standards of beauty or worthiness, body reflexivity is about tuning into our own internal cues, like our hunger, our energy levels, our physical sensations, and then prioritizing those needs over external pressures.
So it's about learning to trust our bodies again.
Exactly. Recognizing that our worth isn't determined by our size or appearance.
Which I imagine can be super challenging to actually do, you know? Like, unlearning years of societal conditioning is no joke.
Oh, absolutely. It's not easy. Manne acknowledges that it's a lifelong process, especially for folks who've been deeply affected by fat phobia.
Right. But it sounds like a journey worth taking.
It definitely is. And it starts with small steps, like just paying attention to how your body feels when you eat certain foods or when you engage in certain activities. Notice what brings you pleasure, what nourishes you, what makes you feel strong and energized.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. And then start making choices that align with those feelings rather than those external pressures.
It's almost like a radical act of self-love, isn't it? Like reclaiming your body as your own in a culture that's obsessed with measuring and categorizing bodies.
Totally. And Manne emphasizes how important intersectionality is in this work. Like, fat phobia doesn't exist in a vacuum, right?
Right. It's all tangled up with other forms of oppression like racism, sexism, classism.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So dismantling fat phobia means confronting those systems as well. It's about recognizing how all these issues are interconnected and working together to create a more just world for everyone.
So it's not just about fat people.
No, it's about all of us. Like, fat phobia affects us all by reinforcing these narrow, often harmful standards of beauty and worthiness. When we challenge fat phobia, we're actually fighting for a more equitable world for everyone, a world where all bodies are celebrated and respected, regardless of size, shape, color, ability.
That's powerful. And it makes me think about another thing Manne talks about, the importance of listening to fat people's lived experiences.
Oh, absolutely. We need to center the voices of those who've been most marginalized and silenced by fat phobia. They have so much to teach us.
Right, like about the realities of living in a world that's often hostile to bodies that don't conform.
Yeah.
And if we listen with empathy and openness, we can start to dismantle those prejudices and create a more inclusive society.
Yeah. A society where everyone deserves to feel safe and comfortable in their own skin.
Absolutely. What about language? Does Manne talk about that at all?
She does. She points out how terms like obese and overweight are often used to pathologize and dehumanize fat people, reducing them to their body size.
Right, like those words carry so much baggage.
Yeah. She encourages us to reclaim language by using more neutral and descriptive terms, like fat.
Just fat.
Yeah, it's a small but significant shift. It's about recognizing that fat is a descriptor, not an insult. And it challenges the medicalization of fatness.
Oh, that makes sense. It's not a disease that needs to be cured.
Right. Manne also challenges that whole moral panic around the so-called obesity epidemic. She argues that it often ignores the social and economic factors that contribute to weight gain, like poverty, food insecurity, lack of access to health care.
So it's not as simple as just telling people to eat less and exercise more.
No, it's way more complicated than that. And she critiques that whole focus on individual responsibility, which just blames fat people for their weight, while ignoring all those systemic forces at play.
It's a much more nuanced and compassionate approach.
It is. It's about recognizing that health is not a one-size-fits-all concept. It's multifaceted, individual. It can't be reduced to a number on a scale.
It sounds like so much of what Manne is advocating for is about challenging those deeply ingrained beliefs and biases we have about bodies, like about which bodies are acceptable and which ones aren't.
It's a tall order for sure, but Unshrinking gives us a roadmap for dismantling these harmful systems. It's a call to action for all of us.
To examine our own biases.
Yeah.
To confront the systems that perpetuate fat phobia. To advocate for a more just world.
Absolutely. A world where all bodies are worthy of respect and dignity.
Regardless of size, it's about creating a culture where everyone can feel safe and comfortable in their own skin.
Manne invites us to imagine a world where our bodies aren't objects for others to evaluate and control, but rather sources of pleasure, strength, and self-expression.
That's a future worth fighting for.
I think so.
Well, that's our deep dive into Kate Manne's Unshrinking. I hope you found it as insightful and thought-provoking as we did. It's definitely challenged me to think differently about fat phobia and what I can do to create a more equitable world for all bodies.
Yeah, me too. It's definitely a book that stays with you.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
See you next time.